Okay, um, I'm David Ayón. I am a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, which is part of Loyola Marymount University. And I'm also a strategist and advisor to the polling and research firm Latino Decisions.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about my book, which is titled Power Shift: How Latinos in California Transformed Politics in America. It was a long time in coming. I have a co-author who reached out to me, a businessman who had been and has always been very involved in politics in LA, about all that he had seen, all of his experiences, and that he had been telling these stories for years. And his friends were saying, "You should write a book. You should write a book." And he looked around for someone who actually could research and write a book to collaborate with to get this book done. And that is that we had certainly observed, and I've been in LA for decades now, we had observed the trajectory of Latino political empowerment. And when he first called me to suggest that we work on a book together, it just happened to be a propitious week. It was the week, as I recall, that the LA Metro System Gold Line extension to the east side, to Boyle Heights and to East LA opened. And the news, both the LA Times on its front page above the fold, as well as the TV news, were full of these images of happy Latinos riding the train. And the actual opening, they actually had a train bust through a ribbon, and you had all these Latino politicians, elected officials were there. All of the elite was there because they had all pulled together to get the metro light rail system extended to the east side. And it occurred to me, that alone occurred to me, an arc, a historical arc of experience of actually that's quite rather poignant and telling about the experience of a community. Because one of the major features of LA's greater east side is that it's bisected by 5 or 6 or 7 freeways. When the freeways came in the 40s and in the 50s and into the 60s, they were put in ways that were truly destructive of Latino neighborhoods. It divided and destroyed neighborhoods. And this came on top of other experiences that had happened, major sort of public works or public-private works. A lot of people refer to Dodger Stadium, for example, the neighborhood that it's in, Chavez Ravine. Actually, there were 3 neighborhoods there. It wasn't that the Dodgers themselves destroyed those neighborhoods. It was a previous battle that left it practically leveled in rubble. And then it was given to the Dodgers where they built the Dodger Stadium. But you had occasion after occasion in downtown Bunker Hill, the freeways on the east side, Chavez Ravine. You had Latino neighborhoods that not only were not consulted, not only were big public decisions made without the input of this community, big public decisions were made that were destructive of this community. And it seemed to me it was a perfect bookend for a book, literally, to look at where the community was when all of that started happening back in the 1940s and where it was by the time we were seeing the Gold Line extended. And not only was the Gold Line metro system line being extended to the east side with a lot of happy people and a lot of happy Latino elected officials, that same week, the very same week, there was groundbreaking for a new high school that was named for Esteban Torres, the Esteban Torres Learning Center. Now, the Los Angeles School District went something like 60 years plus without building a new high school, even though the numbers of students had like maybe doubled or something or more. And since Latino political empowerment started, and you started getting not just one, we had at one time in the 1960s a single Latino member of the LA Public Schools Board, the LA Unified School District Board. It eventually, over time, became majority Latino, and you had a Latina as the president of the school board. And they were able to get through, because of the changes that had been happening politically, the mobilization of this community. They were able to get a school bond passed. A historic bond was passed in the 1990s to start building a new building program, so that by the time my partner and I were working on this book, you had not just the Esteban Torres School, you had the Ed Roybal School, you had the Ramon Cortines School, you had the Sonia Sotomayor School, all about a dozen new high schools and named for Latino political pioneers. So I remember saying to my co-author, George Pla, George, I see the book. I can see the book. What we're talking about here, this experience, is a power shift. Power has shifted. And not just for LA and in LA. This was multiple bases of power were developed on the greater East Side that elected representatives to the state government in Sacramento, to local government, city council, school board, ultimately the county board of supervisors, and to Congress. And when you put all of what they did together, this was a transformation. It's only as a result of what these pioneers, which are featured, 10 pioneers in particular featured in the book, Power Shift, that the census counts Latinos as a complete count. It didn't happen before the 1980 census. That you had elected officials that would start to act collectively together. Initially a Chicano caucus at the State Assembly. It became the California Latino Legislative Caucus over time, and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus on Capitol Hill. And they used to joke in both cases when they would say to their superiors or to the senior members, you know, we formed a caucus, and they would get, in both cases, they'd be asked the question, well, where do you meet, in a phone booth? You know, because there's only 3 or 4 or 5. Actually, the Chicano caucus in the State Assembly started with 5 members. About the same number started on Capitol Hill in Congress. So that, all of these elements together, policy changes, political mobilization, winning representation, amounted to a shift of some consequence. And it all leads up to, because we've had recurring episodes in which Latino communities and Latino leaders and organizations make progress in changing policies, whether it's in education or health or transportation or policing. The community grows. It makes advances in representation, and then a backlash comes. And it's happened over and over again. We had mass repatriation pressures and deportations in the 30s. We had Operation Wetback in the 1950s. You could say that the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 was another setback. It actually really diminished Latino presence in Washington. And we had it, perhaps historically, the ultimate battle was in 1994 in California, when the governor at that time, Pete Wilson, was running for re-election and embraced a really draconian ballot initiative that would deny all public services, with only the exception of emergency services in emergency rooms, to those who could not show legal residence in the state. That sparked a lot of the mobilization. The backlash itself, the setback, because that proposition passed and Pete Wilson was elected, and they both passed by landslides. The backlashes weren't over with, even though the community became much more activated and really surged forward as a consequence of the battle of 1994 over Proposition 187 and Pete Wilson's re-election. We had yet another one in this century, when Arnold Schwarzenegger was able to single-handedly effect the recall of a governor who had been re-elected, Gray Davis, and one of the positions that Schwarzenegger used to both win the recall and get himself elected governor was that he was going to undo the making driver's licenses available to immigrants without regard to their federal immigration status. Now, it had been historically, since California started issuing driver's licenses, that those applying for a driver's license simply had to show residence in the state. They didn't have to show federal immigration papers. That changed in the 1990s, during the backlash of the 1990s. That was overcome in the early 2000s, but then Schwarzenegger led the backlash to that and was actually able to intimidate the state legislature to undo what had been already signed into law. So that was the last of the backlashes that we've seen here. And since the 90s, what we've had is Latino elected officials reach positions of great significance. Speaker of the State Assembly. We've had 5 Latino speakers of the State Assembly. We've had a Latino as president of the State Senate. We now have a Latino Attorney General, the first in California's history. We have a Latino Secretary of State, the first in California's history. And we've got right now 5 or 6 Latinos running for other statewide offices in the state of California. So once again, we're seeing a surge, a real movement forward in terms of representation and policy change, but this time it's facing the biggest backlash ever, and that is the Trump administration in Washington. It is a direct collision between the trajectory of Latino political empowerment, most of all based and led by communities in Southern California. Urban Southern California was where modern Latino politics emerged and was able to make for these changes. That trajectory has run right into an enormous national backlash that was both mobilized and exploited by the Donald Trump campaign in 2016, and as we know, was targeting, in particular, not just immigrants in general, but Mexican immigrants in particular, focusing on the border, opposing where U.S.-Mexico relations had come over the past generation, really. So once again, we see empowerment and backlash going head to head. That's what the book is about.